You know how it is sometimes. A headline pops up.
Yeah, or maybe something catches your eye on social media, something a bit wild.
Exactly, and you think, okay, hold on, what's the real story here?
Yeah. You really want to get behind that initial noise, figure out what's actually happening.
Well, that's precisely what we're setting out to do today. We're doing a deep dive into this recent political promise that came out of Romania. It certainly turned some heads. We're talking brand new two-bedroom apartments for just 35,000 euro.
Wow.
And on top of that, a promise of 0% refinancing for current homeowners.
0%.
Yep, if this particular politician gets elected president.
Okay, there's a lot there. And we're basing this on a specific article, right?
That's right. It's called Georgiul si apartamentele de 35,000 euro, which translates to Georgiul and the 35,000 apartment.
Okay.
It was written by George and Marka, published July 25th, 2024, on a site called Green Angels.
Got it. So maybe you listening have already seen a bit of buzz about this, some news, maybe even a meme.
Probably. But our mission here in this deep dive is to really go beyond that surface reaction. We want to unpack the issues underneath the potential implications.
And it's interesting how the author, George and Marco, frames it from the start. He doesn't necessarily paint this politician, Georgial, as credible, but maybe clever.
Yeah, clever, maybe even a bit cynical. Like he's tapping into a genuinely big problem, a real frustration people have.
Even if the solution he's proposing seems, well, pretty unrealistic on the face of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dig into the specifics. What exactly is being promised here?
Well, the headline numbers are 35,000 euro for a two-bedroom apartment.
Okay.
Then it goes up to 50,000 for 3 bedrooms and 75,000 for 4 bedrooms, brand new places.
And then there's the other part, the refinancing.
Exactly. That's maybe even more eye-catching for some.
Yep.
0% refinancing on your current mortgage. State-backed, apparently.
If he becomes president, that's a condition.
That's the kicker, yeah. Now, the article immediately points out the social media reaction, which was pretty much what you'd expect.
Means, mockery, disbelief.
Totally. People saying, no way, impossible. But the author kind of pushes back on just dismissing it like that.
Oh, how so?
He argues that, the people just laughing it off might be missing the bigger picture. There's something else going on.
And he has evidence for that, like a real-world reaction.
Yeah, he mentions these cusi formate la sedile de partide, basically queues forming at the politicians' party offices.
Wow, okay, so people are actually lining up.
Seems like it. Suggests a real hunger for some kind of solution, doesn't it? Even one that sounds too good to be true. People are responding.
That definitely adds another layer. So what does the author think George is really trying to achieve here? Does he think he can actually win the presidency with this?
Well, that's the interesting twist. The author speculates that maybe the presidency isn't the main goal.
Really?
His prediction is that this is really about the parliamentary elections coming up later in the year.
Ah, okay. So this is a strategy to boost his party's performance there.
Exactly. The author throws out a figure, maybe aiming for 25% to 30% of the seats in parliament. That would give them significant influence.
And is there any data to back that up? Any sense of his current support?
Yeah, the author points to the recent European Parliament elections. Apparently, Jordal got around 15% of the vote,
Okay.
which might not sound huge, but he compares it to a competitor who only managed about 8.7%. So, relatively speaking, that 15% looks pretty strong, shows he has a base.
Right, that context helps. So despite thinking the promise itself is unrealistic, the author sees some value.
It's a strange reaction, isn't it? He actually says he's glad and really happy, his words, that this whole thing is forcing a public conversation about housing affordability.
Is that genuine optimism, do you think? Or is it more like the problem's so bad that any discussion, even from a questionable source, feels like progress?
That's the question, isn't it? It certainly highlights how desperate the situation might be perceived.
Which neatly brings us to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Because this isn't just some isolated weird promise happening in Romania, is it?
Not at all. The author is very clear on this. He says Georgial's promises are plugging directly into a global issue.
The housing crisis.
The housing crisis, yeah, affecting lots of developed countries.
And we need to be clear what that means, right? It's not always about prices crashing.
Exactly. Often it's the opposite in some ways. It's about affordability. Especially for the middle class, particularly in big cities, rent is just becoming impossible for many.
And buying a place feels completely out of reach.
Right. The dream of homeownership is just fading for a whole generation, it seems.
The article mentions a specific example, something from the Financial Times.
Yeah, he references an FT series called Extreme Renting,
Yeah.
and it apparently highlighted how even professionals are struggling.
Professionals, like who?
Like professors, doctors, people in creative fields, consultants, people you'd assume are doing okay financially.
Wow. So even they can't afford decent rent in some places.
That's the picture it paints.
Yeah.
It really shows how deep this affordability problem runs.
And the author connects this to political trends elsewhere in Europe.
hmm He points out how, some extremist parties across the continent have been gaining traction by focusing on housing affordability.
Okay.
They often link it with immigration issues, too, appealing specifically to younger voters. Young adults may be stuck living with their parents because they simply can't afford to move out.
Are there other sources mentioning this trend?
Yeah, he names Politico and The Guardian as outlets that have covered this pattern of using housing and immigration as key issues across Europe.
So the author's take is that George Orwell is basically just adopting a playbook that's already proven effective elsewhere.
Pretty much. Adapting that strategy for the Romanian market, speaking to those frustrations about housing.
Okay, so he's identified a real pain point, a global one even. But the author doesn't just leave it there, does he? He gets into why the situation is so bad in Romania specifically. Who's to blame?
Right, after setting that global context, he definitely pivots to a critique of the situation within Romania. He asks, who's responsible for this crisis there?
And the answer isn't subtle, I gather.
Not at all. He says, "Toti suntem sunteti de vină," which basically means everyone is to blame.
Everyone. Okay, strong words. How does he back that up?
Well, he contrasts Romania with other countries. He points out Romania seems to lack a clear national plan for housing construction.
Unlike where?
He gives Germany as an example, aiming for hundreds of thousands of new units annually, including a big chunk of social housing.
Right.
And the UK allocating like billions of pounds to build around 1 million homes over time.
So he's saying Romania just doesn't have that kind of strategic approach. No clear goals from the government or local authorities.
That seems to be his point. He questions if anyone has set actual measurable targets for making housing more accessible.
And he brings in the role of public discourse, too. Economists, journalists.
Yeah, he wonders if they've consistently pushed this issue, kept it in the public eye. It sounds like he feels there's been a real lack of focus on housing accessibility as a core issue.
What about social housing specifically?
He's quite critical there, says almost none is being built. And worse, existing state-owned stock, he mentions, A&L housing has apparently been sold off.
Sold off. Not used for affordable rentals.
Sold off at what he calls dumping prices. So, yeah, a reduction in publicly controlled affordable options, a missed opportunity, in his view.
Okay, so lack of strategy, lack of social housing, anything else?
Oh, yeah. He also blames frequent legislative changes, specifically mentions tinkering with the VAT, the value-added tax on property.
How does that hurt?
Well, changing the tax rules frequently creates uncertainty and can directly impact the final price for buyers, making planning harder for everyone.
Right.
And he also brings up the persistent problem of blocked construction permits, developers facing huge delays or roadblocks.
Which obviously slows down supply. If you can't get permits, you can't build.
Exactly. It all contributes to the problem. And he highlights this sort of disconnect.
Disconnect between whom?
Between people who already own property, maybe bought years ago, and those, especially younger people or those on lower incomes, struggling to get onto the ladder now.
He gives a specific example for that, doesn't he? In Bucharest.
He does. Says the cost of actually buying a property in Bucharest has almost doubled in just 4 years.
Doubled. Wow. How?
Partly rising prices, sure, but also changes to that VAT threshold he mentioned. It all adds up, pushing homeownership further out of reach for anyone earning less than the average salary.
It paints a pretty bleak picture.
It does. And then he quotes someone, a Mr. Lulia.
Yeah, what does he say?
Lulia apparently said something like, maybe our plan isn't perfect, but the other parties, they offer absolutely nothing.
And the author agrees with that?
Kind of surprisingly, yeah. He seems to concur with the sentiment that, hey, at least Georgial is proposing something while other political forces seem to be ignoring the problem.
Which leads to his warning.
Right. He basically says if this housing affordability issue keeps getting ignored, don't be surprised if Georgial's party ends up with, say, 30% of parliament.
And potentially more power down the line.
Yeah, he warns they could even control the government in the future if prices just keep climbing and frustrations keep building.
So the lack of alternatives is creating a political vacuum that this potentially unrealistic plan is filling.
That seems to be the core argument. And understanding that background really sets the stage for his assessment of the current market dynamics in Romania.
Right, because it wasn't always like this, according to the author.
No, he makes that point quite clearly. Romania, he says, used to be in a relatively better spot regarding housing. Prices were more stable, things were, relatively speaking, more affordable.
But that's changed rapidly.
Very rapidly, he emphasizes. The situation has deteriorated quickly.
And he has data on that, like construction rates.
Mm-hmm. He mentions that housing completions, the number of new homes actually finished, dropped in the previous year compared to the year before that.
So fewer new homes coming onto the market.
Exactly, a shrinking supply.
And is that just down to recent things like inflation or higher interest rates slowing things down?
He argues no, not entirely. Because big construction projects take ages, right?
Yeah, years from planning to completion.
Right. He says 2 years or more for building, plus maybe 1 to 5 years just getting the permit sorted beforehand.
So the houses finished last year.
They reflect decisions and investments made maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, back when the market was actually doing pretty well. He calls it the best period of the Romanian real estate market.
Okay, so completions were falling even based on projects started during the good times. That doesn't sound good for the future supply.
It doesn't. And that's where he sees a potential storm brewing.
How so?
He suggests, look, inflation might start coming down, interest rates might ease off eventually.
Which would normally boost demand for housing, right?
Exactly. People feel more confident, borrowing gets cheaper. So you could see a surge in demand.
But if that demand hits a market where the supply is shrinking,
You could get sudden, sharp price increases. A supply-demand crunch.
and that ties back to his political prediction.
Yep. He basically repeats his warning. Unless they find a way to significantly speed up the authorization and construction of new homes,
Then Georgial's message, however unrealistic, might resonate even more.
to the point where he predicts Georgial could genuinely win the presidency in 4 years.
Wow. That's a stark forecast.
It is. He even throws in this kind of cynical closing remark for that section.
Oh, yeah.
Something about how, hey, maybe in the future people will be selling properties for €35,000, implying things could get that bad, even if Georgial's current promise is just fantasy.
Grim. So after analyzing the context, the market, the politics, what's the author's final bottom line assessment of Georgial himself?
He doesn't mince words. He flat out calls him an imposter.
An imposter.
Yeah.
Strong term.
Yeah. Says Georgial's is just exploiting a really serious situation for votes.
And that he knows the plan is impossible.
Fully aware, according to the author. Knows he likely can't deliver on those promises.
So it's purely about gaining power.
That's the author's conviction. He believes Georgial's primary goal is maximizing his party's strength in parliament, and he'll pretty much stop at nothing to achieve that. Ruthless ambition, basically.
Okay, so let's try and tie all these threads together. We started with this headline-grabbing, maybe impossible promise in Romania. Super cheap apartments, 0% refinancing.
Right. Seems almost absurd on the surface.
But as we've unpacked it through this article, we see it's really tapping into something incredibly real and, frankly, quite worrying.
This deep-seated frustration about housing affordability, which isn't just a Romanian problem, as we saw. It mirrors trends globally in many developed countries.
Yeah, a genuine crisis for many people. And the author's analysis really serves as a, well, like a potent warning, doesn't it?
Definitely. It warns about the political consequences of just ignoring these problems, of not offering credible alternative solutions. When people feel desperate and ignored, they might grasp onto anything that's offered.
Even if it seems too good to be true. It makes you think about housing in your own area, doesn't it? In your city or country. Are there similar pressures, similar frustrations maybe bubbling under the surface?
It's a crucial question. And it forces us to look beyond the immediate political gamesmanship, beyond the headlines.
So maybe the final thought to leave you, the listener, with is this. Considering everything we've discussed, the global context, the specific Romanian situation, the author's critique, what are the realistic paths forward?
What are sustainable solutions for housing affordability? Not just platitudes or impossible promises, but real strategies.
Whether it's in Romania or maybe in a place you know better. What's the right balance? What role should governments play? What about developers? And what about us as individuals or communities?
Yeah, how do we actually address this fundamental need for affordable, secure housing in a way that's fair and achievable? Lots to think about there, long after the initial shock of a 35,000 apartment promise fades.